Gina, just looking at this story here, this is not good news for the Tories, I suppose, on two fronts. Number one, they've had a senior minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, resigning over this bullying scandal. But also in terms of the reaction to it. There's a lot of now chattering amongst themselves with regard to Tory MPs, talking about internal party issues and reform of the civil service and all the rest of it. Well, I suppose that's not what the country is perhaps most talking about today.
Hi, Tom. I have to say, why doesn't number 10 have a cat flap? As a cat lover, I agree with you on that one. But on the issues that are hitting the headlines today, for me, this is very important, and I'm hoping instrumental in us talking about bringing in something like the ministerial code into law, because a lot of this is things we've seen played out before when there have been other scandals. The process doesn't seem to work. It's too much in the hands of individuals and prime ministers. There should be much more process as we would have in normal places of employment, so that we don't have this waste of time, effort and political capital. So I think this hopefully will be a time when there are lessons learned, because we can't have people in the workforce feeling that they are too afraid to speak up. And you can't have bosses saying that they can't be professional. So I think there's an awful lot here to unpack. But I think if you read the report, two things that struck me from the Tolley report. One was on page 18, point 84, where Mr. Tolley recants that Mr. Raab wrote to him trying to get him to change the terms of reference. And Tolley QC had to write back to Mr. Raab saying that he didn't accept his representations of the terms of reference. So, read what you will into that. But you could argue that that's almost sort of a form of putting pressure, if not bullying, onto somebody who's doing an independent investigation. And I think the second thing is, it's not about the quantity or quality. It's actually about the fact that this is now not conjecture. There are two complaints that have been upheld. These are bullying complaints. This is not about professionalism. This is not about cultural resistance that I know Dominic Raab spoke about a lot culturally in the civil service across different departments. Because there are other of his fellow ministers who I would say are pretty tough and have an ideological point of view, and they're not complaints against them.
It's interesting looking at the sort of wording within this report. It seems that some of the criticism is due to this sort of idea that Dominic Raab had to, for want of a better word, micromanage what his civil servants were doing, whereas perhaps other ministers see themselves as more of a hands-off approach, saying, this is the course of action I want you to take, but not really being specific about how that is done. I wonder if there's just a fundamental disagreement revealed here between how Dominic Raab sees the role of a minister and how some of his civil servants saw the role of a minister.
I think you've got something there in that, if Dominic Raab turned up and said that, right, he uses this term of cultural resistance, so therefore he didn't trust, there is an element of trust there between him and his workforce, and that they're going to try and work against him at every turn. But then that's a bit like saying, he instructs them to build a bridge, but they have, he then brings in an engineer who says, well, actually, if you build that bridge, it'll fall down and people will die. But I'm just going to ignore you. Just do the thing I've told you to do. That's not being a good leader. Good leadership is about bringing people in and listening to them. But the role of the civil service is to work and enable ministers to enact their policies, but also to use their experience and knowledge to say when something won't work, and actually to be constructive in their feedback. And if you've got someone who sees that as just saying no rather than being constructive, then you have to question their leadership.
Now, of course, you're calling for the ministerial code to be sort of codified in law, for want of a better term.
Yes.
Is this not an example of the ministerial code to some extent working? What the Prime Minister might say is that complaints were made, an independent investigation was launched, that investigation took place independently of government for 5 months, and yes, the Prime Minister is the ultimate arbiter of that code, but clearly the conclusions of the report were such, and the frankly open media that we have in this country is as it is, that this process ended with a resignation. Is that a process that hasn't worked?
I think it's a process that hasn't worked, because if you've got a ministerial code into law that's like a contract, you have much clearer parameters around it. But also, when you have the time, effort that is wasted, and political capital, when you have these scandals and you have these toing and froing. And also, the other thing that I think is a complete waste is the amount of money that these lawyers make every time a judge or a lawyer is brought in. You know, if you have a process and you have a committee that's there, that's their job. I mean, the civil servants have a code that's legally binding. Why don't ministers have a code that's legally binding? You know, this is a free-for-all for lawyers rather than anyone else. And I think it's a waste of so much. We just should know. And I think we should know where people stand, but I think it would create a cultural shift. And that's, I think, very, very important, that everyone knows where they stand. They know what is legally allowed. They know we have definition of bullying. It's put into law. It's not in the hands of a prime minister. It's not up to a minister to request an investigation into himself. You know, I think all of this has to be codified.
It's interesting, I suppose, one of the issues as to why Adam Tolley conducted this investigation rather than the independent ethics advisor is there was no independent ethics advisor when these complaints were brought, leading to a lot of that confusion at the start. Well, Gina Miller, I wish we could talk more about this, but we do have to move on for now. Thank you very much for your contribution this afternoon.